Leonard and I were married in June of 1972. We had our wedding night at a bed and breakfast in Cape Cod, and I remember it with a clarity that surprised me when I looked for it recently. Not because it was perfect, but because it was the first thing that was entirely ours, unself-conscious, unguarded. The way things are when you are still young enough not to know yet how complicated the years will make them. We did not have a real conversation about intimacy, about what we actually wanted, what had changed, what each of us was carrying and not saying, until April of 2020, 48 years into the marriage. I am a retired physical therapist. I spent 30 years helping people find language for what their bodies needed. I sat across from patients and asked them to describe what they were experiencing, precisely, specifically, without minimizing. And I helped them find the words when they couldn't find them on their own. I never applied any of that to my own marriage. The conversation finally happened because we were locked down together with nowhere to go. And Leonard was 74 years old and had been waiting long enough. He put down his book one morning and asked me something no one had asked me in decades. What do you actually want? Not what you think I want. What do you want? The question undid me, not because it was cruel, because it was kind, and I did not know how to answer. And the not knowing told me more about what we had been doing for 48 years than anything I had understood before that morning. I'm 79 now. Leonard died in October of 2022. We had 2 years on the other side of that conversation, after 48 on this side of it. I want to tell you what we found and what we lost by waiting. I should tell you what I assumed because the assumption is where everything began to go wrong. In the early years of the marriage, the first decade or so, when we were in our 20s and early 30s, the intimate dimension of our life together had a quality that I can only describe as uncomplicated. Not perfect, not always effortless, but unself-conscious in a way that required no vocabulary, no navigation, no particular courage. We were young and close. And in the early stages of learning a person the way you only learn them across time. What we had then was real, and I do not want to diminish it by describing what came later. The assumption I made, and I made it so automatically, so far below the level of anything I would have called a decision, that I could not have named it while I was making it, was that what we had in those early years was the fixed form of what we would always have. That the texture of our intimacy at 25 and 30 was the template, the standard, the thing that would persist more or less unchanged across the decades. And that any departure from it in either of us would represent a loss, a diminishment, something to manage rather than something to speak about. I was a physical therapist, which means I spent my working life in the clinical vocabulary of bodies, assessing range of motion, identifying where pain originated and what it was telling the person it lived in, helping people articulate what their bodies needed in terms specific enough to act on. I was good at this. I was patient and precise, and I understood that the gap between a person's experience and their ability to describe it was often enormous, and that closing that gap was part of what I was there to do. I helped people say things about their bodies that they had been carrying wordlessly for years. I came home from that work every evening for 30 years and had none of that vocabulary available for the thing that had begun in my early 50s to shift in myself. The shift was not catastrophic. It was the ordinary change that most women experience in the middle years. Desire that changed in character and frequency, that needed different things than it had needed at 30, that was not less real, but was undeniably different. And instead of naming it, even to myself, I organized around it quietly. I remained available in the way I had always been available, presenting a continuity that did not fully reflect what I was actually experiencing, because I assumed that any departure from the early template would register to Leonard as loss. I thought I was being generous. I thought I was protecting him from something he didn't need to be burdened with, my own changing interior, the natural evolution of a 50-year-old woman's intimate life. I told myself I was being a good partner. I was being, in fact, dishonest, in the way that people are dishonest when they confuse management with love. My sister Margaret is 4 years younger than me. She was married to her first husband, Frank, for 20 years and divorced him in 1999 when she was 48. She remarried in 2007 at 56, a man named Paul, who she had met through a colleague. I watched this with a private skepticism I am not proud of now. I thought of it as evidence of Margaret's incapacity for sustained commitment, her preference for the novel over the enduring. I thought of my own marriage, still intact and still functioning, and I felt the quiet superiority of someone who had built something lasting. What Margaret had done by starting over with Paul was have the conversation by necessity. She didn't have decades of accumulated assumption to navigate around. She had a new person who didn't know her history, who had to ask, who had to be answered, who brought his own honest account of what he needed and expected her to bring hers. The conversation happened not because either of them was particularly brave, but because there was no shared history to hide behind. They were required to be honest from the beginning, and out of that requirement, something was built. Margaret said something to me around 2010, 3 years into the second marriage, that I stored somewhere and failed to examine for another decade. She said, "Paul asks me things about myself that Frank never asked in 20 years. It's terrifying the first time, and then you feel completely relieved." I nodded and said that sounded wonderful, and thought privately that this was simply the quality of newness, that any new relationship would produce that kind of asking, that openness, and that what she was describing was the honeymoon effect, rather than anything that could be built from scratch inside an old marriage. I thought I was being realistic. I was being, in fact, wrong about nearly everything she was telling me. Leonard and I had built across 48 years what appeared from the outside to be a working, intimate life. What we had built from the inside was something more complicated. A structure of mutual accommodation, organized around what each of us assumed the other wanted and needed, with very little actual inquiry into whether those assumptions were correct. We had each decided, without consulting the other, what the other's interior life looked like. And we had been living side by side inside those wrong decisions for decades. Each of us being generous to an imagined version of the other person. Each of us protected by that generosity from having to say the true thing. April 2020. We had been in lockdown for 3 weeks. Leonard had been retired for 10 years by then. I had retired in 2018. We were, for the first time in our marriage, together constantly without the infrastructure that had always organized our time apart. No work, no separate errands, no evenings where one of us was elsewhere. The ordinary mechanisms by which long-married people give each other room were not available. We were in the house together all day, with nothing between us but the accumulated fact of 48 years. We were reading on a Tuesday morning, Leonard in the armchair, me on the sofa, the spring light coming through the front window. I don't know what he had been thinking about before he put his book down. He had not given any signal that something was coming. He just set the book on the arm of the chair and looked at me with an expression I recognized as the one he had when he was about to say something he had been composing for a while. He said, "I've been thinking about something and I want to ask you a question. And I want you to answer it honestly rather than the way you think I want you to answer it." I said, "Yes, of course." The way you say yes, of course, when you don't yet know what you're agreeing to. He said, "What do you actually want? Not what you think I want. Not what we've been doing. What do you want? From me. From this part of our life. What would it look like if it were what you actually needed it to be?" I sat with that for a long time. The room was quiet, the particular quiet of those spring weeks when the streets were empty and the ambient noise of a normal world had gone away. And I noticed, in that quiet, that I did not have an answer. Not because the question was unanswerable, because I had stopped asking it of myself so long ago that the mechanism for answering it had gone still. I had spent so many years organizing myself around what I assumed Leonard needed, that I had lost, somewhere in the middle of the marriage, the habit of checking what I needed. I said, "I don't know." And Leonard said, "That's a place to start." What followed across the next several weeks was the conversation we should have had in 1995, or 1985, or 1975, a year into the marriage, before the assumptions had time to calcify. It was halting and uncomfortable and interrupted by meals and the news and the ordinary business of two people living together. And we did not arrive at any sudden clarity in a single afternoon. It was a conversation that happened in pieces, over weeks, returning to itself the way a conversation does when the people having it are not entirely sure yet what they are trying to say. What I told Leonard, slowly and imprecisely, and with the specific discomfort of saying a true thing after a long time of not saying it. What I wanted was not what I had been performing, not the urgency, not the form of the early years, sustained artificially into our 60s and 70s. What I actually wanted, what I had wanted for years without naming it, was something slower and more continuous, more presence and less event. The specific warmth of being near him, skin contact without agenda attached, the sustained physical closeness that is its own thing and that we had been treating as a prelude to something rather than as sufficient in itself. I had been performing a version of our early intimacy while wanting something that had no name in the template we had built together. And I had never said this. And the not saying had produced a growing distance between what was happening and what I was feeling about it. Then Leonard told me his side. He said he had known for years that something had changed. He had felt it, not as a specific thing, not as something he could have articulated, but as a general quality, a slight temperature difference in the room. And his response to feeling it had been to try not to impose himself, to protect me from a desire he assumed had become unwelcome. He had been waiting for a signal that I wanted something before doing anything that might feel like pressure, and the signal never came. Not because I didn't want anything, but because I had been performing a willingness that prevented any signal from registering. He read the performance as contentment. He had been protecting me from his own need based on a reading that was entirely wrong. Two people, 48 years, each one organized around the other's assumed interior state, each one performing generosity toward an imagined version of the other, neither of them asking, neither of them answering. A marriage that from the outside looked functional, and from the inside was two people being careful with each other in ways that produced over time the specific loneliness of not being fully honest with the person you sleep beside. I want to name that loneliness carefully because I think it is one of the least spoken about qualities of long marriages. It is not the loneliness of being alone. It is the loneliness of being present and still performing, of being in the same bed, the same room, the same life, and still managing what the other person sees, still holding something back because the conversation that would have allowed you to let it go had not happened. You can be more physically intimate with someone than you are with anyone else in the world, and still be lonely inside that intimacy if the intimacy has never been honest. And the loneliness of that is particular. I do not have another word for it. After the conversation, after the weeks of returning to it and finding new edges of it, and slowly saying the true thing instead of the managed thing, something changed in the texture of what we had. Not a miracle, not a return to the early years, which we could not have recovered, and which, I came to understand, were not actually what I had been missing. What changed was that the intimacy became honest. The performing stopped. What was between us was what was between us, without the layer of management. And that turned out to be the thing I had wanted, without knowing it had a name. One morning in the summer of 2021, about a year after the conversation began. I woke up before Leonard, the way I often did. He was still asleep, his hand resting on my shoulder, which was where it had been when we fell asleep the night before. Nothing was happening, no occasion, no particular closeness that would have distinguished the moment from 100 other mornings. And I lay there in the early light and I thought, this is the real version. This is what it was supposed to feel like the whole time. This ordinary morning, this hand, this particular quality of being near him without anything between us and the fact of it. We had been in the marriage 54 years by then. The real version had been available the whole time. We found it in the 53rd year. Leonard was diagnosed with cancer in the spring of 2022. He died in October of the same year at 76. He was not in pain at the end, which I am grateful for, and he died at home, which was what he wanted. And I was with him, which was what I wanted. And none of that makes it anything other than what it is. The grief I've been living in since October 2022 has a specific quality I did not anticipate. It is not only grief for Leonard, the actual man, the 54 years, the weight and the humor, and the way he looked when he was reading something he disagreed with. It is also grief for the years before April 2020, for the version of the marriage that was available and that we did not find until there were 2 years left. 2 years. That is what I have. 2 years of the honest version, the one where I knew what I wanted and said it, the one where Leonard stopped protecting me from himself, the one where what was between us was actually between us, rather than two people's management of what they assumed the other needed. 2 years after 48 of the other kind. I have thought a great deal about why the conversation didn't happen earlier. And I want to be honest about this, because I think the reasons are the same reasons most people don't have it. The first reason is that I did not know it was a conversation I was refusing to have. I was not conscious of avoidance. I was conscious of what I thought was consideration, of being careful with Leonard, of not burdening him, of not introducing a difficult thing into a marriage that was working. The conversation never happened, not because either of us was cowardly, but because neither of us understood that something true needed to be said. We thought we were being generous to each other. We were being, instead, strangers in a very specific way. The second reason is fear, and this one I understand more clearly in retrospect, because I can feel its shape from the outside now that I am no longer inside it. I was afraid that saying what I want has changed would be heard as, I want less of you. I was afraid that naming the shift would name it as loss, and that Leonard would receive it as a statement about his inadequacy, rather than as an honest account of my interior life. I did not trust that honesty could be received as love. I thought it would be received as withdrawal. So I withdrew instead from honesty, which produced a much more thorough withdrawal than anything the truth would have required. Here is what I know now that I did not know in 1995 or 2005 or even 2015. The person who loves you is probably also managing something, probably also organized around a set of assumptions about you that are at least partly wrong, probably also performing a version of themselves toward what they imagine you need, in the same way you are performing toward what you imagine they need. Two people managing each other in opposite directions, simultaneously, across decades, each one convinced they are being protective, and each one producing the loneliness of being near someone and still not quite known. Leonard was waiting for me to say something. He told me this. He had known for years that something had shifted, and he had been waiting, quietly and without complaint, for me to give him something to respond to. The conversation he asked for in April 2020 was not a confrontation he had been building toward. It was a question he had been carrying for a long time, waiting for the right moment. And the lockdown forced the moment into existence. If the lockdown had not happened, I do not know when we would have gotten there. I think about that. My sister Margaret called me in the fall of 2022, just before Leonard died. We talked for a long time, as we sometimes do when something serious is happening. And I told her what we had found in those 2 years and what I understood about what we had missed. And she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "The thing about Paul asking me those questions early on is that I was so afraid. And then I answered, and he answered back, and nothing catastrophic happened. And the whole marriage was built on that not catastrophe." I think that's what most people don't know, that the catastrophe they're afraid of never actually comes. She is right about that. The catastrophe I had been protecting Leonard from for 30 years, the statement that things had changed, that I needed something different, that the early template was no longer the accurate one, was not a catastrophe. When it arrived, when I finally let it arrive, Leonard received it with the same quality he had brought to most hard things across our marriage, steadily, without drama, with the particular care of someone who had been waiting to know the true thing for a long time. If you are in the middle of a long marriage and there is a conversation you have not had about what you actually want, about what has changed and what hasn't, about what you have been performing and what you have been missing, I want to tell you that the conversation is not what you think it will be. It will not mean what you are afraid it will mean. It will not produce the rupture you have been protecting against. What it will produce, in my experience, is relief. The specific physical relief of saying the true thing to the person who is supposed to know it, who has been waiting to know it, who has been carrying their own version of the same managed performance and will be glad to be done with it. Leonard asked me a question on an April morning in 2020, and I didn't know how to answer it. But I tried to answer it honestly, and he tried to answer it honestly back. And what we built from those answers was the best version of our marriage. The one I wish we had found in 1985. The one I think we could have found in 1985, if either of us had known the asking was allowed.